Britain is to scrap development aid to India. Critics argue the fast-developing nation no longer needs the money, and Britain can't afford it. But with billions of dollars being sent to relatively well-off countries, is foreign aid getting to those countries that need it most? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Stephen Cole. Britain is pledging a new approach to foreign aid with a greater focus on helping the world's poorest. But that won't include India. A multi-million-dollar aid programme will end in 3 years' time. Critics of foreign aid argue that pouring millions into relatively wealthy countries devalues the concept of aid. Well, the UK is among the world's top foreign aid donors, and it's committed to increasing expenditure in line with the United Nations targets. But as the world's major donors face economic problems of their own, some are arguing that foreign handouts will be better spent at home. From London, Emma Hayward reports.
India is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Its manufacturing industry has helped make it a global player. For some, the rewards have been huge. For millions, poverty remains a daily reality. Last year, the UK government gave almost $450 million in aid to India, but after 2015, there will be no more money.
And there's no doubt that India is developing very successfully, and I think it's absolutely right to sit down with them and talk about what we want the shape of our development relationship to be over the coming years. So this is something that we've sat down and agreed with them. I think it's absolutely right, and it does reflect the fact that India is now a big economy developing successfully.
The UK says the relationship will move from one focused on aid towards trade. The UK's granting of foreign aid has been increasingly controversial at home. The UK economy is only just out of recession, and many believe it can no longer afford its overseas aid programme. And in India too, there have been signs that it's become unpopular. Earlier this year, the then Finance Minister insisted the aid was no longer needed. India's situation has changed, some say.
In the past, it has been a very good thing. It's been given on very favourable terms. In fact, much of it has been grants rather than loans. But today, the situation has changed decisively. India is not grasping for this type of aid.
But aid organisations are concerned, claiming India's poorest people may miss out.
Well, we feel that it's too soon. There has been progress made in India. There used to be 100,000 kids that got polio every year, and now that's down to 0. So there has been progress. Aid's making a difference, but the job's not finished. 250 million Indians will go to bed hungry tonight, and 1/3 of the world's poor are Indians. So now's not the time to be saying goodbye.
It's unlikely, though, the decision to halt aid will be reversed. India's economic ascent continues, as does the suffering of millions of its people. Emma Hayward, Inside Story.
So can the world's wealthier countries still afford to fund the poor? To discuss this, I'm joined by our 3 guests. From London, Owen Barder, Senior Fellow and Director for Europe at the Centre for Global Development. He was a former senior official at the British Department for International Development. From New Delhi, Chetan Sharma, Senior Financial Analyst and columnist. And also in London, Alex Scrivener, Policy Officer for the World Development Movement and a specialist on aid. Well, Owen Barder, let's begin with you. On the face of it, India is a country, a BRIC country, that's growing wealthier seemingly every year. Why should Britain, growing but suffering severe austerity measures, give out millions of pounds worth of aid?
Well, it's obviously terrific that India is now growing fast and that is improving the lives of many of the people in India, both the wealthy and some of the burgeoning middle class. And the British government is clearly absolutely right to be looking at things like trade and other things that we can do to help be partners in that. But the fact is that there are still a very large number of very poor people in India, and on average it's still a country with very modest incomes. So although we're aware of the growing inequality and the very large number of wealthy people, there's an enormous number of very poor people who are being reached with British aid at the moment.
Well, Chetan Sharma, India's Foreign Minister Salman Khurshid says that aid is the past and trade is the future. Let's hear, before you answer, what he had to say exactly.
We discussed a lot of trade, investment, cooperation, international, bilateral, multilateral, and I think that's how we see our relationship grow. Aid is the past and trade is the future.
Well, Chetan, you just heard Owen talk about the poor. There's still a need. But does that, from the Foreign Minister, mean there's no need for British aid anymore, indeed aid from anyone anymore?
I don't think so, because if you look at the fact that trade anyway continues, and it's continuing in leaps and bounds, even today, I mean, India remains the third largest investor in the UK, and outside the EU, it's the biggest market of British goods. So trade is continuing and continuing well. Let me just tell you about 4 or 5 different views that are emanating out of India, which will give you a better perspective and perhaps my take on them. Firstly, of course, that the aid is too small. Perhaps, but having said that, it's still 9 times what the US aid is, so it's not that insignificant. Secondly, there's the argument that India has its own nuclear and space program and therefore doesn't deserve aid. Now, that perhaps is a little unfair because it's comparing apples with oranges. And also the fact is that India's own social program is not being spent or being diverted to space and defense budgets, because the social spending is 23 times that. We spend about 3 billion on defense and space and about 70 on social welfare schemes. So there is no passing on benefit to the other side. The third thing, which perhaps is very important, is that the aid money is being misutilized and it's finding its way through corrupted sources. Now that, of course, is an argument that holds good, but you just don't stop building schools because, you know, money is not reaching the poor. Schools have to be built, they have to be empowered with teachers, but the fact is that you don't have to route it through the government, you can do it through social bodies that are working on the ground and do it creatively. So that can happen. And also, the final thought is that, you know, as what even your story mentioned, India is the fastest growing economy. You know, India is relatively getting richer now, but then don't forget that India still houses half of the world's poor and half of the world's malnourished. So there is gross inequalities. We ourselves are fighting with subsidies, and the fact remains that aid in the current form perhaps is not the best way. If we can find a solution wherein there is a win-win, wherein there is trading of skills, where there is social upliftment out here, which also finds economic benefit in Britain, I guess that's the way forward.
Chetan, thanks for that and for those thoughts, and we'll be coming back to the couple of those, especially your comment about misutilised because of corruption. But I want to go to Alex Scrivener next. And the UK international aid budget is currently about $18 billion. That's an astonishing sum, isn't it, for an economy struggling with debt? The amount Britain is proposing to spend on foreign aid will outweigh what it spends on its own police force. That's not sustainable.
Well, first of all, I don't think I agree at all. I mean, we spend just 0.6 of our, not even that much actually, 0.6 of our gross national income for overseas aid. And if you look at sort of how big this sum is, I mean, if you compare it to the amount of money that UK foreign policy and sort of the trade policy through the World Bank and the IMF, we're actually sucking out of developing countries through unfair trade. It's actually not very much money at all. And I think, first of all, to return to sort of the aid to India point, I think what we must remember is, I think both the other people in this programme have said, that India is a country full of very, very poor people. It's one of the most unequal societies in the world. 500 million people in India live in conditions of extreme poverty. So that's under $1.25 a day. So I think when we talk about sort of giving aid from rich countries to poor countries, I think that's an outdated way of looking at aid. I think we shouldn't be thinking about it as rich countries and poor countries, but in fact, rich people and poor people. And there are a lot more poor people in India than there are in the UK. So the Indian Foreign Minister, he's wrong, is it? It does need aids because, as you say, so many living on that $1.25 under that figure a day is just too much for India to bother with. Well, I think the real debate here isn't sort of how much aid we give and how much money countries like the UK should contribute. I think the real issue is what we're spending this aid on. And I think the most disappointing aspect of Justine Greening's announcement today is that she's cutting the precise form of aid which is actually most helpful to countries like India. So at the moment the UK is contributing to many sort of Indian government schemes which are actually doing a lot to increase levels of health and education in India, and that stuff is all being scrapped. What's being retained is the private sector element. So Andrew Mitchell, the previous International Development Secretary, talked about creating a sovereign wealth fund and channeling aid money to the private sector, to big business, supporting things like special economic zones, which is all about giving tax breaks to big corporations. And that's the kind of ideological sort of neoliberal free market form of development which the government is trying to support in India, and that will continue to keep going. The problem is that that kind of development doesn't reach the poor.
Andrew Mitchell is history now. Owen, can we go to you? Does the donor country, do you think, ever hope to benefit economically or politically?
I think there's a big debate about this, and often aid is presented as something that's in the donor country's own advantage, either because of economics, because it will help generate export orders, or it will improve the country's reputation, or that it might help our security, or that it might lead to that we could, for example, see less spread of diseases around the world. Those are all good reasons for why we should have an aid budget, but actually for most citizens in rich countries, the reason they want to give aid is because they think that making a small contribution to improving the lives of people who are living in absolute poverty is a worthwhile thing to do for moral reasons. And so I think I think there are strong reasons for giving aid and continuing to give aid in a country like India, not because we expect to sell guns or some more benign export as a result of it, but because as a result of British aid at the moment, there are something like 800,000 children in India in primary school as a direct consequence of our aid. There are children who are receiving nutritional supplements either through pregnant mothers or as infants. And if we don't give that aid, and if those children don't receive those supplements, those children will grow up, have every chance of growing up stunted, malnourished. They're less likely to succeed in school. They will have cognitive impairment. They'll be physically stunted, and that's something that they will never get back. So we cut aid today, and that generation of children grows up stunted as a result of this. And so for most people, this isn't about whether or not it's good for the British economy. For most people, this is about whether it is actually reaching the poor people in India. And there's very good evidence that it is. It's very good evidence that it's making a huge difference. And that seems to me the most compelling argument for it.
Okay, well, we've looked very much at India and Britain, but let's look at the international picture, the greater international picture, and look at where most of the foreign aid is indeed coming from. Well, these are the 5 biggest aid donors in the world as of last year. The United States is way out in front, committing more than $30 billion a year. Germany gives $14.5 billion, with the UK, in fact, not very far behind. And the UK is followed by France and then Japan at $10.5 billion. And these are the biggest recipients. Afghanistan receives the most, more than $5 billion. Indonesia gets almost $3 billion. And India, the country which the UK wants to cut aid to, receives about the same. China gets $2.4 billion in aid, and Iraq gets just a little less. Chetan, coming back to you, can the West really afford these very hefty handouts while their own domestic economies suffer a lot? I mean, I was reading that Kofi Annan now wants the UK and the EU, no less than Kofi Annan, to stop giving these billions in aid. He wants BRIC countries to wean themselves off aid. Is that a natural process, or do they need to start doing that consciously?
I think they need to, because, you know, if you look at it, where it's most important to understand where the money is going and whether it's actually reaching the correct victims, so as to say. Now, if that's not happening, obviously there's no rationale. But if it is, and then if you're growing up overall as a healthier society, there's going to be a cross transfusion and there's going to be a cross help somewhere down the line. I mean, it's the same argument that goes for outsourcing and domestic jobs. At the end of it all, if you're going to outsource jobs and get an economic benefit and then fund your own society, you're going to have a global benefit. But let me come back to the points which are being made about poverty in the system and, and the corruption which is not enabling money to reach the poor. Now, look at the 3 states where the money is coming and going to. Bihar, Madhya Pradesh and Orissa, 3 of the very poor states as far as India is concerned. Statistically, of course, the percentage of poor are the largest. But having said that, Bihar is also now India's fastest developing state. So you do have a situation where somewhere down the line, there is an improvement overall. Now, certainly that's not happening because of aid, but if there is an overall improvement, perhaps the aid money will be catalyzed to better resources. The other side of the argument that is that corruption still grows. In fact, the old comment, the most infamous comment of our Prime Minister, our former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, was that a rupee of money spent by the government exchequer, only 16 paise reach the actual person for which it's required. 84% actually gets wasted away in corruption as well as all kinds of negativities. Now that perhaps is true, and that's something that needs to be controlled. Well, so, as I said earlier, if the money is directed through social organizations on the ground and not routed through the government, then the egoistic statements that are coming from the government that India doesn't require aid will not be important, as well as the people who really need the money, as what is being said. We're talking about 800 billion people, and that impact will be felt. Okay,
I'll go to Alex next, and then Owen. Alex, first of all, let's move on from this point that Chetan so rightly makes. Shouldn't the emphasis be on trade, not aid? The UN Conference for Trade and Development, and I'm reading a line from that organisation now, believes investment to teach business skills and innovation is far better than aid. It's known as import substitution. Is that the way to go?
Well, I do, first of all, definitely agree that we need to think of a vision beyond aid. We need to remember that development and aid are not the same thing. Aid was never going to be anything more than just a sticking plaster. And people, I think, have too high expectations of the things that aid can achieve. But at the same time, we must make sure, I don't think the answer is either trade or aid. I think the real answer is that we must be using our aid budget, we must be using the whole gamut of public policy options we have as developed countries to help people in poorest countries of the world. And for example, I think from here, I think the most important thing to remember is that the NHS, for example, is something that in this country has been shown to be a very positive, very successful way of running a healthcare system. Why aren't we exporting things like that, expertise like that, to the developing world? Why are we promoting things like public-private partnerships, privatisation, things that are actually experiments that have actually failed in the UK here? We need to make sure that when we talk about aid and trade, it's not just about sort of a very sort of myopic developmental debate. We're actually talking about how we in developed countries can actually help poorer countries more holistically, and sharing our expertise.
This is not holistically, this is actually, Owen, wouldn't that import substitution policy allow a country to, blaze a trail in technology or improve skills, perhaps even develop education? And also, to meet the point that Chetan makes, the risks of corruption are far less with that kind of policy, aren't they?
I think there's a danger that we're all going to agree with each other and make this a dull conversation. But I think this is a really important point, that if you want to see developing countries grow and not need aid in the future, which is something that the Foreign Minister was talking about, aid being behind us, trade ahead of us, then there are lots of things that need to happen in the world system. And what I think is most disappointing about the announcement of the British government is not that they are cutting the aid budget, but that there's so little on the table about what it is that we're going to do to enable India to be a successful, prosperous partner in the global economy. We're at a time when the European Union is, if anything, is moving backwards in terms of trade. We're moving to a more protectionist regime as the existing system of preferences come to an end. India is being required as a condition of agreement to a free trade agreement with the EU to open up its markets to our exporters. And I think that's absolutely the wrong thing for us to be insisting on. We should be opening up our markets to Indian goods and especially services. We should be opening up our labour markets to enable high-tech Indian skilled engineers to come here and add to our economy and to their economy, to learn and trade and exchange with each other. And it seems to me that is exactly the direction that, that we all want to move in. But there's nothing in the announcement today about how we're going to do that. Instead, what we've got is some stuff about how we're going to send technical assistance over to India, so the British can tell India how we think they should run their economy.
Well, they didn't actually say that. They said
let me just say I disagree with Alex completely.
They just said they're going to share their expertise, was the exact phrase.
Right. And what that means is a whole bunch of technical assistance. It's a bunch of people sitting in Delhi and elsewhere in India, providing our advice on how we think they should run their economy. If India wants and needs expertise, they're wealthy enough to buy it in the world market. They don't need us to give it to them. They don't need us lecturing them, nor do they need us lecturing them on how they should run their health service or their other social services. What we should be concentrating on is not lecturing India on how they should run their economy, but we should bring that group of people who we're proposing to spend on doing that over to the European Union and to the British government to figure out how we can open up our markets to Indian goods and services. We should be looking at how we're going to tackle climate change, how we're going to tackle migration policies, how we're going to tackle our own sales.
Owen, thanks. I want to put that to Chetan. Chetan, because Owen's sort of making this almost an issue of condescension. The British are being condescending to India and giving them aid and expertise. Do you see it like that? Do Indians see it like that? Well, apart from the foreign minister, that is.
No, I look at it, in fact, I look at it the other way. I said this cannot be an ego issue. This is not something that's been channelized to the Indian economy per se. I think we shouldn't look at aid as help. We should look at it as a contribution. And that's the way it is. That's a positive term. We already have our own problems to do with subsidies and aids. You know, there is an argument we tend to take our grants for granted. And that's something that's, you know, why our petrol prices have been kept the way they are, and they're actually disincentivizing its proper commercial use or its effective use or even its proper savings. So there is an argument on that side. But I think, you know, Stephen, instead of using the word aid versus trade, we've got to look at the word aid versus a trade-off. I said this before, it has to be a win-win situation. Let it be a contribution that's coming from Britain, let it continue the way it is, but try and ensure vis-a-vis that contribution, let's say if it's towards the health sector of a particular state, there can be a reverse contribution from that state which benefits Britain as well. Let there be a win-win, a direct trade-off, where it, you know, the contribution happens, so there is whatever charitable thought process within the global scenario that had to be done is being done, but there is a return of that. There is something that goes in return as well, which pacifies and perhaps satisfies the need for which that aid has been given. So there is an overall a holistic win-win.
All right. Alex, would you go with that? Why not make sure aid only goes perhaps to the poorest countries, say those in the lowest quintile of GDP per head, or limit aid to flagship projects, are the ones that we've heard about, certainly about education or safe drinking water?
Well, again, I'd like to say that I think we should get away from this vision of sort of rich countries and poor countries. I mean, we're increasingly becoming poor people in rich countries. I mean, look at the UK, where the cuts have devastated sort of a large part of the economy here. And we have a situation in which lots of people here are quite badly off, despite the fact we're one of the richest countries in the world. So I think sort of limiting aid to just lower income countries isn't quite the answer. But I think before I move, I'd like to take issue with something that Owen said, actually, about so we shouldn't be lecturing developing countries. I think we are lecturing developing countries when we're telling them opening their markets, that free market ideology, the sort of the route of the World Bank and the IMF is the answer to their development problems. I think we should be open to sharing the best of our expertise, like I said, like the NHS, like all the successful policies that we've managed to implement domestically in the UK. But at the same time, we shouldn't be telling developing countries that the free market and neoliberalism is the way forward, is the way for development. Because, like in India, for example, and in Bangladesh and lots of these countries, they have gone down that route in terms of inviting foreign investors and sort of giving them tax breaks. And all that's done is to create more sweatshops. You've got people who are working for less than £1 a day, and that's not development. That's not pro-poor development anyway.
No. Owen, you have a last word, but you've only got about 20 seconds.
Let me just say that the 8 poorest states in India contain more poor people than the 26 poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So although India is a country of great richness and great wealth, it's also a country of great poverty. And we should not overstate how rich India is today. If you were to average its income across the whole population, it would still be a very poor country.
Thank you very much, Owen Barder in London, and also to Chetan Sharma from New Delhi, and also from London, Alex Scrivener. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. I'm Stephen Cole. Goodbye to you.